The Most Sentimental Man by Evelyn E. Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joshua Sexton. The Most Sentimental Man by Evelyn E. Smith. Johnson went to see the others off at Idlewild. He knew they'd expect him to, and, since it would be the last conventional gesture he'd have to make, he might as well conform to their notions of what was right and proper. For the past few centuries the climate had been getting hotter. Now, even though it was not yet June, the day was uncomfortably warm. The sun's rays glinting off the bright metal flanks of the ship dazzled his eyes, and perspiration made his shirt stick to his shoulder blades beneath the jacket that the formality of the occasion had required. He wished Clifford would hurry up and get the leave-taking over with. But, even though Clifford was undoubtedly even more anxious than he to finish with all this ceremony and take off, he wasn't the kind of man to let inclination influence his actions. "Sure you won't change your mind and come with us?" Johnson shook his head. The young man looked at him, hatred for the older man's complication of what should have been a simple departure showing through the pellicule of politeness. He was young for, since this trip had only slight historical importance and none of any other kind, the authorities had felt a junior officer entirely sufficient. It was clear, however, that Clifford attributed his commandership to his merits, and he was very conscious of his great responsibility. "We have plenty of room on the ship," he persisted. "There weren't many left to go. We could take you easily enough, you know." Johnson made a negative sign again. The rays of the sun beating full upon his head made apparent the gray that usually blended into the still thick blond hair. Yet, though past youth, he was far from being an old man. "I've made my decision," he said, remembering that anger now was pointless. If you're just too proud to change your mind," the young commander said, less certainly. "I'm sure everyone will understand if... Johnson smiled. "No, it's just that I want to stay. That's all." But the commander's clear blue eyes were still baffled, uneasy, as though he felt he had not done the utmost that duty, not duty to the service but to humanity, required. That was the trouble with people, Johnson thought. When they were most well-meaning, they became most troublesome. Clifford lowered his voice to an appropriately funeral hush, as a fresh thought obviously struck him. "I know, of course, that your loved ones are buried here, and perhaps you feel it's your duty to stay with them?" At this, Johnson almost forgot that anger no longer had any validity. By loved ones, Clifford undoubtedly had meant Eleanor and Paul. It was true that Johnson had had a certain affection for his wife and son when they were alive. Now that they were dead, they represented an episode in his life that had not, perhaps, been unpleasant, but was certainly over and done with now. Did Clifford think that was his reason for remaining? Why, he must believe Johnson to be the most sentimental man on earth. "And come to think of it," Johnson said to himself, amused, "I am, or soon will be, just that." The commander was still unconsciously pursuing the same train of thought. "It does seem incredible," he said in a burst of boyish candor that did not become him, for he was not that young, "that you'd want to stay alone on a whole planet. I mean to say, entirely alone. There'll never be another ship, you know. At least, not in your lifetime." Johnson knew what the other man was thinking. If there'd been a woman with Johnson now, Clifford might have been able to understand a little better how the other could stick by his decision. Johnson wriggled, as sweat oozed stickily down his back. "For God's sake," he said silently, "take your silly ship and get the hell off my planet." Aloud, he said, "It's a good planet. A little worn out, but still in pretty good shape. Pity you can't trade in an old world like an old car, isn't it?" "If it weren't so damned far from the center of things," the young man replied, defensively assuming the burden of all civilization, "we wouldn't abandon it. After all, we hate leaving the world on which we originated. But it's a long haul to Alpha Centauri, you know that, and a tremendously expensive one. Keeping up this place solely out of sentiment would be a sheer waste. The people would never stand for the tax burden." "A costly museum, yes," Johnson agreed. How much longer were these dismal farewells going to continue? How much longer would the young man still feel the need to justify himself? If only there were others fool enough. If only there were others with you. But even if anybody else would be willing to cut himself off entirely from the rest of the civilized universe, the Earth won't support enough of a population to keep it running. Not according to our present living standards, anyway. Most of its resources are gone now, you know. Hardly any coal or oil left. And that's not worth digging for when there are better and cheaper fuels in the system. He was virtually quoting from the Colonial Officer's Manual. Were there any people left able to think for themselves? Johnson wondered. Had there ever been? Had he thought for himself in making his decision, or was he merely clinging to a childish dream that all men had had and lost? With man gone, Earth will replenish herself, he said aloud. First, the vegetation would begin to grow thick. Already it had released itself from the restraint of civilization. Soon it would be spreading out over the continent, overrunning the cities with delicately persistent green tendrils. Some the harsh winters would kill, but others would live on and would multiply. Vines would twist themselves about the tall buildings and tenderly, passionately squeeze them to death, eventually sending them tumbling down. And then the trees would rear themselves in their places. The swamps that man had filled in would begin to reappear one by one, as the land sank back to a pristine state. The sea would go on changing her boundaries, with no dikes to stop her. Volcanoes would heave up the land into different configurations. The heat would increase until it grew unbearable. Only there would be no one, no human anyway, to bear it. Year after year the leaves would wither and fall and decay. Rock would cover them, and some day, billions of years thence, there would be coal and oil, and nobody to want them. Very likely Earth will replenish herself, the commander agreed. But not in your time, or your children's time. That is, not in my children's time, he added hastily. The handful of men lined up in a row before the airlock shuffled their feet and allowed their muttering to become a few decibels louder. Clifford looked at his wrist chronometer. Obviously he was no less anxious than the crew to be off, but for the sake of his conscience he must make a last try. Damn your conscience, Johnson thought. I hope that for this you feel guilty as hell. That you wake up nights in a cold sweat remembering that you left one man alone on the planet you and your kind discarded. Not that I don't want to stay, mind you, but that I want you to suffer the way you're making me suffer now, having to listen to your platitudes. The commander suddenly stopped paraphrasing the manual. Camping out's fun for a week or two, you know, but it's different when it's for a lifetime. Johnson's fingers curled in his palms. He was even angrier now that the commander had struck so close to home. Camping out. Was that all he was doing? Fulfilling childhood desires, nothing more? Fortunately, Clifford didn't realize that he had scored, and scuttled back to the shelter of the manual. Perhaps you don't know enough about the new system in Alpha Centauri, he said, a trifle wildly. It has 2 suns, surrounded by 3 planets, Thalia, Aglaia, and Euphrosyne. Each of these planets is slightly smaller than Earth, so that the decrease in gravity is just great enough to be pleasant, without being so marked as to be inconvenient. The atmosphere is almost exactly like that of Earth, except that it contains several beneficial elements which are absent here, and the climate is more temperate. Owing to the fact that the planets are partially shielded from the suns by cloud layers, the temperature, except immediately at the poles and the equators, where it is slightly more extreme, is always equable, resembling that of Southern California. Sounds charming, said Johnson. I too have read the Colonial Office handouts. I wonder what the people who wrote them will do now that there's no longer any necessity for attracting colonists. Everybody's already up in Alpha Centauri. Oh well, there will be other systems to conquer and colonize. The word conquer is hardly correct, the commander said stiffly, since not one of the 3 planets had any indigenous life forms that was intelligent. Or life forms that you recognize as intelligent, Johnson suggested gently. Although why should there be such a premium placed on intelligence, he wondered. Was intelligence the sole criterion on which the right to life and to freedom should be based? The commander frowned and looked at his chronometer again. Well, he finally said, since you feel that way and you're sure you've quite made up your mind, my men are anxious to go. Of course they are, Johnson said, managing to convey just the right amount of reproach. Clifford flushed and started to walk away. I'll stand out of the way of your jets, Johnson called after him. It would be so anticlimactic to have me burnt to a crisp after all this. Bon voyage. There was no reply. Johnson watched the silver